Now rumor has it she ain't got your love anymore. Rumor has it.
Oh, hey. Just listening to some pre-game music. What do we have on the docket today? Rumors? Makes sense. In this video, we're going to look at the Great Fear and the rise of emigration in the summer of 1789. These two things illustrate the instability in France during the early part of the Revolution, and they set up why radicalization occurred later on in the Revolution. For this video, you're going to need something to take notes with, and one primary source, Arthur Young's Travels in France. To begin, let's first look at the situation in the provinces in the summer of 1789. Most of our discussion of the revolution so far has really taken place within the confines of Paris and Versailles. Now it's time to look at what stuff was like outside of those places, what stuff was like in the rest of France. The terrible harvests of 1788 and 1789 had a significant effect on the countryside. Although one might expect that bad harvests would have less of an effect on the countryside than it would in the cities, the reality is that it was just as destructive to rural populations as it was to urban ones. This had mainly to do with the food-to-population ratio in France by the end of the 18th century. Between 1770 and 1790, the population of France grew by about 2 million people. The rural population constantly complained that there were simply too many mouths to feed in villages. Most landowners, in fact around 70%, didn't own even 1 hectare of land, the minimum amount of land estimated to sustain a family of 4. So most rural inhabitants had to find supplemental work in order to survive. This was easy when harvests were good and work was plentiful, but when bad harvests hit, fewer workers were needed, wages decreased for those who were lucky enough to get work, and the price of food went up. The desperate agricultural situation for rural populations resulted in a large and growing number of what they called wanderers in France. Peasants who could not feed themselves went on the move, begging at provincial estates or crowding into towns and cities looking for work, charity, or anything that might help. It was estimated that some 20% of the rural population in Normandy in 1790, for example, engaged in this behavior at some point during the year. Farmers constantly complained about wanderers nicking part of the harvest or even stealing cattle or sheep. Wanderers often traveled in groups in order to assure their own safety, and this led many to fear that the groups would act as uncontrollable mobs, desperate and willing to do anything to survive. When work, begging, and smuggling were dead ends, peasants took to even more radical measures to survive. If you can remember, riots and small rebellions were fairly frequent in 18th century France. They were often the only way that peasants could express their discontent and affect the political process. But the number of riots rose dramatically in the summer of 1789. As early as March, food riots commenced near Cambrai and Valenciennes. More followed in April in Dunkirk and Lille. But nothing compared to July. In July, the number of riots rose to an all-time high. Over 1,000 separate incidents occurred in various parts of France. On July 27th alone, there were 145 different armed rebellions in the country. Much of the rioting occurred in the wake of the defiance of the National Assembly in Versailles and the storming of the Bastille in Paris. You see, French people throughout the kingdom had been paying attention to the political happenings in the States General. Most deputies were given specific instructions by their provincial delegations to report regularly on what they were doing and on what was going on in Versailles. And so for this reason, there were hundreds upon hundreds of letters being sent by way of the post from delegates to all parts of the country. And this brings us to the question of how long it took news to travel in 18th century France, an important question for understanding the Great Fear. The short answer is anywhere from a half a day to 4 days. Post carriages traveled at around an average speed of like 6 to 7 miles per hour. So nearby towns like Orléans or Chartres could receive news from Paris in about 10 hours or so. Tours took about 20 hours to reach. Rennes, in the northwest, got news from Paris in about 27 hours, so a little over a day. 2 full days were spent on the road for Lyon and Bordeaux, and 3 from Marseille and Toulouse. Only the towns in the Pyrenees were more than 3 days from Paris. So word of events at the kingdom's center could permeate all of France within the course of a single week. Why does this all matter? Because the events in Paris and Versailles in June and July 1789 had a dramatic impact on the rest of France. When word came of the creation of the National Assembly and of the tennis court oath, municipalities throughout France began to set up their own revolutionary councils. When news of the Bastille reached the provinces, there were celebrations and parties by those excited by the prospect of a popular check on the absolute monarchy. Perhaps the most significant moment was when the provinces got word that the king had ordered the first 2 estates to join the National Assembly on June 27, 1789. The provinces saw this as the king's acceptance of the Third Estate's claim for equal representation and a direct repudiation of the system of privilege enjoyed only by the kingdom's first 2 orders. There was, however, a darker side to this communication. News from Versailles wasn't only about events. Deputies and newspapers also shared the texts of speeches by delegates of the National Assembly. And some members of the National Assembly were saying things that were pretty inflammatory. Don't forget Mirabeau's passionate discourse during the royal session of June 23rd. Similarly, Bertrand Barrère, a deputy in the Assembly, had been suggesting since June that the food shortages that France was experiencing were not natural. Convinced that France had plenty of capacity to feed its populace, Barrère suggested that the only reason that food shortages, high bread prices, and the distribution of inferior quality food were happening was because enemies were plotting against the nation. The food crisis was, according to Barrère, the disastrous projects of enemies of the people, enemies of humanity. And he suggested that the only solution was for these people to be discovered, intimidated, and punished. Both political news and political rumors were being spread to people in the countryside, and both would have an important effect on how French peasants reacted to the opening stages of the revolution. To get a closer look at what things were like in the provinces during the summer of 1789, I want you to pause this video now and read the primary source that I talked about earlier on, Arthur Young's Travels in France. This is an account from an Englishman who traveled all throughout the French countryside during the summer of 1789. So you'll get a sneak peek at what life was like outside of Paris at this time. All of Arthur Young's observations are fascinating, but I was particularly taken by this one passage. Walking up a long hill, he writes, to ease my mare, I was joined by a poor woman who complained of the times and that it was a sad country. Demanding her reasons, she said her husband had but a morsel of land, 1 cow, and a poor little horse, yet they had a franchard, or 42 pounds, of wheat, and 3 chickens to pay as rent to one seigneur, and 4 franchards of oats, 1 chicken to pay to another, besides the very heavy tithe and other taxes. She had 7 children. It was said at present that something was to be done by some great folks for such poor ones, but she did not know who nor how. The woman's experience seems indicative of the dire situation in the countryside. The peasants were simply destitute. There was little hope of relief, and the things that she identified as the main problems were the feudal obligations she had to local lords and the tithe, the tax of the king. It's no wonder that in the ensuing events, refusal to pay seigneurial dues and royal taxes featured as some of the most significant ways the provincial peasants participated in the revolution. In brief, the countryside was a powder keg. It was ready to explode with just a little spark. And already in July 1789, that spark was coming. Dire material conditions mixed with a little dose of rumor set the countryside on fire and led to what historians have called the Great Fear. News from Paris sparked all sorts of revolutionary actions in the provinces. First, the most widespread response came upon hearing news of Necker's dismissal on July 11th, a few days before the storming of the Bastille. Like Parisians, denizens of provincial towns reasoned that Necker's dismissal was the first domino of royal revenge against the National Assembly. Upon hearing news of Necker's dismissal, many revolutionaries in provincial France seized power and weapons from local authorities. In Nantes, a crowd seized the public coffers and took over the powder magazines at the arsenal. In Dijon, the crowd seized the fort and the armories, set up a local militia, and as a final touch, imprisoned the military commander stationed there and confined all nobles and priests to house arrest. Provincial towns also began to form alliances with each other, making promises that local militias would support each other if an attack was made on them. In the countryside, news of Necker's dismissal and other revolutionary events came a bit later, and the reaction of the rural population was even more radical. By July 20th, most rural populations had learned of the king's approval of the National Assembly. Peasants became convinced that the king's actions represented his condemnation of the entirety of the seigneurial system and the systems of privilege that existed in old regime France. Already impoverished and desperate, they took the king's actions as license to act against the nobles in their own regions. Many peasant communities immediately stopped paying seigneurial dues and taxes. They also joined in crowds and demanded concessions from local aristocrats. In Franche Comté, a region on the eastern border of France, a riot started around July 16th when townspeople in Vesoul set up a new revolutionary committee that would take over the management of the town and invited local nobles to affirm their acceptance of the new body. Much of the rural peasantry had entered the town to witness the event, and when the nobles made their way into Vesoul, they were immediately insulted and threatened. The situation became so tense that one local lord fled the town and the entire region on the 17th, and then the crowd proceeded to march to his chateau and set it on fire, looting and pillaging the place before it burned down. It was estimated that they took upwards of 200,000 livres worth of property in their assault. From there, the revolt spread. Another chateau was burned on the 21st. A nearby monastery was sacked on the 22nd. Almost no noble residence in the region was left untouched. Peasants seized peasant rosters and ledgers, documents that kept records of their debts to local nobles, and burned them. And when nobles were home, they forced them to sign away their privileges and allow free access to their mills and wine presses and ovens and even hunting grounds. Peasants systematically dismantled the system of feudalism that had reigned supreme in the French countryside for centuries. In the wake of these provincial revolts, many in the countryside feared noble reprisal. Would aristocrats return to their homes and get revenge? Would they enlist royal authorities to arrest all those who had participated in the revolts? The small town of Pontoise exemplified this type of reaction. After having stolen much of the corn supposedly headed to Paris and sacking noble estates along the way, the people of Pontoise heard that constables from Paris were on their way, quote, asking for heads. The people boarded themselves in their homes for protection. In this environment of fear, many began to blame the revolts on so-called brigands. Peasants accused brigands of being the ones who had led the assault on noble estates, not them. This allowed them to place the blame for the destruction of these estates on someone else. Municipal authorities furthered the rumor that brigands were responsible for actions in the countryside because it gave them a reason to maintain their newly formed local militias. Even aristocrats went along with the myth in order to have an excuse to try to restore their feudal rights and act as if nothing had happened. In other words, everyone seemed to have a vested interest in promoting this myth that brigands were responsible for the peasant revolts of July 1789. It was a convenient myth. The problem, however, is that the myth got out of hand. Stories started coming in about continued attacks. On July 21st, a priest from Saint-Denis claimed that a band of brigands attacked him and robbed him while he was on the road. Days later, municipal authorities from Évreux confirmed that there were groups of brigands posing as members of the militia and harassing people in the countryside. Not helping matters was the fact that there were actually town militias patrolling the countryside, and many of these militias were interpreted as bands of brigands coming to get the local population. Soon, panic emerged that an aristocratic plot to exact revenge on peasants and revolutionaries by hiring brigands to act as thugs was underway. This was the Great Fear, a wave of panic that swept the French countryside. Towns began to mobilize. Women fled into the forests. Men buried their valuables and armed themselves. Sentries were posted, barricades erected, scouting parties sent along the roads, night watches commenced, provisions requisitioned, gunpowder and munitions collected, and pieces of artillery placed in position to defend towns and cities. And what made this situation so unique is that it wasn't resigned to just one area. Over the course of the first weeks of August 1789, the Great Fear spread around the Ile-de-France, around Normandy and Provence, the Loire Valley, Franche-Comté, Burgundy, all the way down to the Pyrenees. No brigands ever emerged, though there are stories of militias encountering each other and firing on each other in fear. But this didn't make the fear any less real. One of the results of the provincial rebellions and the Great Fear is that it prompted an exodus of French nobility from France. Starting in the summer of 1789, we start to see waves of aristocratic emigrations, right? People leaving France and leaving the revolution. It all began in late June and early July, when important members of the bonne noblesse and even the royal family found themselves frustrated by the course that the revolution had taken and scared that they might find themselves on the wrong end of a popular revolt. Immediately following the storming of the Bastille and the violence against Launay, Foulon de Douai, and Berthier de Sauvigny, in Paris, the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, decided to leave Versailles and move to Turin, outside of the kingdom. Soon after, other aristocrats also left. The king's other brother, the Prince of Lambesc and his family, and the Polignacs, close friends of the queen. These were the first people to leave France on account of the revolution. But members of the bonne noblesse weren't the only ones leaving. On their way out of France, these aristocrats passed through the countryside, and their travel was not inconspicuous. Other nobles noticed and got the idea that they themselves should leave. This was particularly popular in the wake of the provincial revolts and the actions of the peasants during the Great Fear. Nobles whose estates were ransacked decided that they ought to leave lest they have a similar encounter again in the future. This is particularly true in the borderlands of the kingdom. In areas such as Franche-Comté in the east, many nobles simply loaded carriages and crossed the border, hoping to find safety in foreign towns and cities. This wave of emigration took on meaning for revolutionaries and for peasants throughout France. For in leaving, the nobles seemed to be affirming their opposition to the revolution. It was assumed that these nobles, however, would not stay gone. They had too much stuff and too much property in France to just leave forever, so the fear arose that when these aristocrats returned, they would return armed, with foreign troops ready to take back what they felt was rightfully theirs. Émigré, the word used to describe someone leaving France, became code for a person who was a counter-revolutionary. What didn't help was the fact that the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, was in fact planning a possible military incursion in France to relieve his brother of the pressure of the National Assembly and the revolution. The Comte d'Artois became just the most notable example of what many felt was the birth of a new revolutionary resistance. The revolution made many aristocrats feel as though their privilege and even their wealth was under attack. And in the next lesson, what you'll find is that their fears were largely correct. Okay, that's it for this video. Don't forget to bring your notes to class and bring the readings to class, and I'll see you soon.